The frozen air hung motionless over the southern treeline outside Bastogne on December 22, 1944, the kind of cold that glued breath to skin and turned steel into stone. Staff Sergeant William Bill Carver, 26 years old, hunched inside a half-collapsed foxhole, his gloves stiff, his fingertips numb even inside them. Snow had blown in during the night, filling the trench until it pressed against his ribs. Somewhere beyond the pines, German armor groaned like distant thunder. Carver's issued M1911 sat heavy in his hand, the slide already sluggish from the cold. He racked it once, twice, feeling the grit of frozen lubricant resisting every inch. 11 close-range engagements survived, 3 confirmed pistol kills, and a dozen close calls that should have ended him, yet the number that kept gnawing at him wasn't his tally. It was the new one whispered through the companies, 43% casualties in 1 week. Nearly half the men swallowed by the forest. And now, in the dim blue half-light, something shifted in the trees. Carver raised the pistol. He exhaled sharply. The trigger broke. The hammer fell. The gun jammed. This is Berg, and you're watching Firepower World War II. If you respect real history and the weapons carried by real men in real battles, subscribe now and stay with me, because what you're about to hear is one of those stories that almost rewrote the entire war, all because a pistol refused to fire. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't supposed to happen, at least not like this. The German High Command had gambled everything on a winter offensive designed to shatter the Western Front, slice the Allied line in two, and recapture Antwerp before the Americans could react. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow drowned motor pools. Roads turned to glass. The 101st Airborne, Carver's unit, found themselves surrounded at Bastogne, holding a shrinking perimeter against a force 10 times more supplied, 10 times better positioned, and 10 times more ready for the weather. Artillery thundered day and night. Trees exploded into splinters. Machine gun nests vanished under white waves of mortar fire. Carver's job was simple in theory and brutal in practice: hold the southern approach and prevent German scouts from slipping through the treeline. If the scouts succeeded, panzer units could follow, and Bastogne would fall in a matter of hours. But the cold didn't care about strategy. Oil thickened. Slides slowed. Magazines contracted. The forest became a graveyard for American small arms. Every time Carver's platoon spotted movement, the Germans were already aiming. Every time they braced for a counterattack, someone's gun locked up. Courage couldn't heat steel. Training couldn't overcome physics. The pattern repeated itself with ruthless consistency. Carver saw it happen to Private Leon Adler, the Indiana kid with a buzz cut so short his scalp stayed red. Leon used to whistle taps at night, soft enough that only the boys in the next foxhole heard. On a gray morning near the old lumber road, Adler's grease gun froze solid just as a German patrol broke through the fog. He slapped the charging handle, cursed, slapped it again. A burst from the treeline stitched the air around him. He never fired a shot. Then there was Corporal Frank Kowalski, the Detroit machinist who taught Carver how to polish a feed ramp using nothing but toothpaste and a scrap of cloth. Frank had a mind like a workshop. He could diagnose a magazine issue by sound alone. And yet, during a frantic push near the crossroads, his M1 carbine stovepiped after the first round. He ducked, cleared, tried to fire again. A second stovepipe. A third! Before he cleared the jam, shrapnel tore through his flank. He hit the snow like a drop wrench. And Sergeant Rob Hensley, the Tennessee hunter. The big man with the quiet voice. He could read animal tracks like a newspaper. His Thompson had always run hot, loud, and loyal, until the night the temperature plunged to 20 below. When a German assault group crept up the ravine, Hensley racked the bolt. The handle snapped clean off. The fight lasted 40 seconds. Hensley bled out under a maple stump, whispering for someone to take his wedding ring. Carver watched them fall, one after another, good men beaten not by German skill but by frozen steel. The guilt settled in him like a second layer of frost. How do you fight when even your weapon refuses? How do you win a duel when your enemy is already aiming and your sidearm turns into an ice block? The manuals talked about discipline, fields of fire, angles of attack, but none of them explained how to keep a pistol alive at -22. None of them told you how to stop your friends from dying because a slide wouldn't move. The mechanical failure wasn't random. It was inevitable. Oil thickened until it turned the pistol's internals into glue. Springs lost tension in the cold. Magazines shrank just enough to throw alignment off. Cartridges stuck. Firing pins hesitated. Every American sidearm in that forest was working against the man holding it. The enemy didn't need to outshoot them, nature was already softening them up. One night, while packing snow into sandbags near the barn ruins that served as temporary shelter, Carver noticed something strange. His wool wrist warmer, threadbare, frayed in spots, was warm. Not just warm but nearly hot compared to the metal in his hands. Back on his family's small farm in Ohio, his dad used to fix tractor engines in winter using strips of wool dipped in kerosene, wrapping them around frozen bolts to trap warmth and loosen metal. The memory hit him hard, uninvited, and painful. The dark barn around him seemed to tilt. His gaze dropped to his pistol, then back to the sleeve. It was an insane idea. A stupid one. The Army manual explicitly forbade anything that could obstruct a slide. But Carver felt the weight of Adler's last breath, of Frank's unfinished joke, of Hensley's broken Thompson. He could keep following the book and watch more men die, or he could break a rule no one would ever forgive him for. He pulled his sleeve off slowly, fingers trembling from cold and fear, and cut a strip of wool with his pocket knife. He held it over the pistol slide, imagining the heat sinking in, imagining the fabric keeping death at bay for one more hour. Then fatigue hit him hard, and the world dimmed around the edges as he lowered the pistol into his lap and listened to German artillery echo far beyond the trees, promising the same dawn they had delivered every day before, one filled with frost, fear, and ruin, as if the forest itself wanted to see how long a man could endure before something broke inside him. Carver tested the wool strip in the dark, moving slowly so the fabric wouldn't rustle and betray him. He wrapped it around the M1911 slide, angling it beneath the rear sight, then rewrapped it twice until the tension felt right against his palm. The pistol looked ridiculous, like someone had tried to knit a winter coat for a weapon, but the warmth was instant. Even through his gloves he could feel the difference. He tried racking the slide. Too tight. The wool tugged. He unwound a single layer, then another. Now it moved, but sluggishly. He tightened one edge with his thumb, loosened the other. The slide glided smoother. Not perfect, but smoother. He tried again, this time more confident. The pistol cycled, not flawlessly, but with enough life to give him hope. The barn around him creaked as wind pushed through gaps in the boards. Somewhere outside, boots crunched snow. Carver froze. The patrol was passing close, much closer than usual. He held his breath, slid the pistol beneath his coat, and waited. One of the Germans paused, breathing hard. Carver could hear it, shallow and nervous. Maybe they were new recruits. Maybe they were veterans exhausted from their own cold march. Either way, after several long seconds, they moved on. Carver exhaled and continued adjusting the wool. It took him nearly 40 minutes to find the balance he wanted. Wool tight enough to trap heat, loose enough to let the slide run free. Each adjustment felt like a gamble. Too loose and the cold would win. Too tight and the pistol would jam worse than before. He kept working until his fingers throbbed with pain from the cold and the strain, But when he finally found the configuration that allowed the slide to rack cleanly, he closed his eyes, exhaled, and let his shoulders sag. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of control. He tucked the pistol under his arm to keep it warm and waited for dawn. Morning came slow, reluctant, dragging a thick gray fog across the clearing near the frozen creek. Carver and two replacements moved along the line, checking sectors. The replacements were kids, one maybe 19, the other barely 20. One carried a carbine that rattled when he walked. The other kept adjusting his helmet as if trying to find comfort in a place that offered none. Carver didn't bother learning their names yet. Names became heavy weights when you had to say them to the medic or write them on a bag. Movement flickered in the tree lean. Carver stopped. Held up a fist. The replacements froze. German scouts, 3 of them, slipped between the pines, rifles ready, boots soft on the snow. Carver's heart hammered. This was the pattern. This was how his friends had died. The enemy saw them first. The enemy fired first. And American guns froze. Carver drew his M1911. The wool wrap brushed against his palm. He pressed his thumb to the slide. Warm. Alive. He took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The pistol barked, loud against the silence. The slide cycled cleanly, smoke curling around the wool. One scout dropped, folding into the snow. The other 2 flinched, broke formation. Carver advanced, signaling the replacements with a gesture that felt automatic, instinctive. The kids flanked left, firing bursts. One bullet cracked into a tree trunk. Another grazed the scout's shoulder. The Germans retreated, stumbling back into the fog. Carver waited for the familiar horror, the click of a frozen slide, the dead weight of a gun refusing to fight. It didn't come. The M1911 stood ready, warm, hungry for another round. For the first time in a week, Carver felt like the forest wasn't killing them from the inside out. He could breathe. The small victory spread fast. By noon, word had passed down the line, Carver's Colt doesn't freeze. It sounded like superstition, like something soldiers tell each other when they're desperate, but desperation was exactly what fueled innovation in foxholes. By evening, half the platoon had torn sleeves off their undershirts, wrapping their pistols the same way. By the next morning, armorers were pretending not to notice the modifications, giving quiet nods as long as the wool didn't interfere with the action. Unofficial testing began. Men dipped pistols in snow, left them exposed on crates overnight, then brought them inside their coats for a quick warm-up. Pistols wrapped in wool fired. Those without failed more often than not. The numbers weren't scientific, but they were undeniable. Casualties along Carver's sector dropped. Response times dropped. German infiltration attempts slowed as Americans shot back quicker, with more precision. Small victories added up. Cold steel had stopped betraying them. Across the forest, German units felt the difference. Scouts who once slipped through the perimeter now met stiff resistance. Patrols that expected slow American reactions found themselves under fire almost instantly. Rumors spread through the German ranks, the Americans have warmed their guns. Some thought the Allies had developed a chemical agent, some believed new lubricants had been issued. No one suspected the truth, that the solution was nothing more than wool from the inside of a uniform, cut by a knife in a ruined barn. Carver watched the shift happen with cautious hope. It wasn't dramatic, it was incremental, subtle, like a tide creeping back in. Men who once froze in terror at the thought of their guns failing now moved with confidence. They pushed back with small, sharp counterattacks. They weren't winning the war from their foxholes, but they weren't losing it anymore either. The line held. Then came the day the major arrived. A tall man with a stone jaw and a mustache sharpened by cold wind, he walked the line with an aide carrying a clipboard. Soldiers stiffened as he passed. Carver kept cleaning his pistol, pretending the wool wasn't there, even though it was impossible to miss, a dark wrap around a gun that should have gleamed bare. The major stopped. "Look down." "Sergeant," he said, voice hard as frost. "What is this?" Carver swallowed. "Field adaptation, sir." "Unauthorized." The major picked up the pistol. His gloved thumb traced the wool, pressed against it, feeling the heat. He racked the slide. "Smooth. Quick. Clean." He said nothing for a long moment. Carver's lungs held still. The forest felt silent enough to hear a snowflake land. Finally, the major returned the pistol. "Standardize it," he said quietly. "Without paperwork." And that was it. No commendation. No official note. No recognition. Just a cold man in a colder forest deciding that the rules mattered less than survival. The adaptation spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, entire companies had modified their pistols. By the end of the month, men were passing wool strips to new arrivals like a rite of passage. Some tied them with knots. Others wove them through their holsters. The idea mutated, improved, personalized. But at its core, it stayed the same, warmth trapped against steel. The Battle of the Bulge raged on. Bastogne endured until the skies cleared and Allied aircraft roared overhead again. Relief columns broke through. German offensives stalled. And through it all, Carver's method kept the pistols alive during the worst cold the forest could muster. No one tracked the exact number of men saved, but later estimates suggested 50 to 90 American lives might have hinged on that simple rap. Carver never thought of himself as an inventor or a hero. He was just a farm kid trying to keep his friends alive. After the war, he returned to Ohio, married a girl he'd known since 8th grade, and became a mechanic, working in the same kind of workshop his father once used to fix frozen tractors. He kept a box of wool strips in his tool chest, not for pistols, but for memory. He didn't talk about the forest. Didn't talk about Adler, Kowalski, or Hensley. Once a year on Christmas, he called the surviving members of his platoon, sometimes saying only a few words, sometimes sharing a quiet laugh. They understood without needing details. Decades passed. Carver's story faded as the official histories focused on tanks, generals, and sweeping maneuvers. His wool-wrapped pistol remained nothing more than a rumor among the few who survived. But small details tend to leave footprints, even if faint ones, and one such footprint waited silently in an old maintenance log stored in a forgotten box in a Pennsylvania archive, ready for the day someone curious enough would stumble upon it and wonder why a field inspector in 1945 wrote a single cryptic line about unusual cloth-wrapped sidearms found among airborne units, not realizing it would become the first breadcrumb in a trail leading back to the coldest days of the war. The breadcrumb waited until a young historian named Daniel Thomason, researching small arms failures during extreme weather campaigns, stumbled across it. At first, he assumed it was a misprint or a clerk's shorthand for a field repair note. But the phrasing kept gnawing at him, unusual cloth-wrapped sidearms. That wasn't standard. That wasn't routine. That was someone noticing something odd in the middle of a brutal winter offensive. Thomason dug deeper, requesting additional records, cross-referencing unit reports, personal letters, and scattered fragments from the 101st Airborne. The more he pulled, the more the thread unraveled back toward a single point, a small cluster of foxholes on Bastogne's southern perimeter where pistols apparently kept functioning when countless others froze. He tracked down 2 surviving veterans. Both were in their late 90s, frail but sharp enough to recall the cold with a precision that made Thomason shiver. One remembered a sergeant who did something with wool. The other remembered being handed a strip of fabric by a quiet man who didn't talk much but saved our necks more than once. Neither could recall the sergeant's name, only that he was from Ohio, tall, and carried himself with a calm that steadied those around him. That was enough. Thomason contacted local archives in Ohio, searching for veterans from Bastogne with mechanical backgrounds. One obituary stood out. William Carver, mechanic, survived the Bulge, known for helping neighbors fix machinery during harsh winters. Survived by his widow, Margaret. Thomason made the drive in late autumn, leaves crunching under his boots as he approached a small white farmhouse on a quiet road. Margaret Carver answered the door with a softness that only comes from a long life spent loving someone deeply. When Thomason explained why he had come, she blinked twice and invited him inside without hesitation. On a small table sat a shoebox she had kept since her husband's death. Inside were photos from the war, grainy, worn at the edges, and beneath them, folded carefully, untouched by time, was a strip of wool. Thomason felt his throat tighten as he lifted it. The fabric was rough, faded, and frayed, but he could picture the hands that cut it, wrapped it, trusted it. Margaret told him that Bill never bragged, never wrote memoirs, never corrected anyone who assumed he had simply held his line like all the others. He returned from the war wanting nothing more than to repair engines, raise his children, and live quietly. She had found the wool strip in his tool chest a year after he died. She didn't know the story behind it, only that he had looked at it the way someone looks at a gravestone, with respect and sorrow intertwined. Thomason published a small article in a military history journal, detailing the improvised wool wrapping method and its potential role in preventing weapon failure during the Bulge. It was read by maybe a few hundred people, mainly enthusiasts, researchers, and veterans' families. But to those who understood what the winter of 1944 had demanded, the story resonated deeply. Not because it glorified a single man, but because it captured a truth rarely acknowledged: wars aren't always altered by grand strategies or famous generals. Sometimes, they turn on the decisions of an exhausted sergeant in a freezing barn who refuses to accept that the universe has stacked the deck against him. Years later, in a small regional museum, a standard issue M1911 sat inside a glass display under soft yellow lights. The plaque beneath it read simply, U.S. Army Sidearm, Battle of the Bulge. No mention of wool. No mention of Carver. No mention of the frantic nights when the cold tried to break men faster than bullets could. Visitors walked past, reading briefly before moving on to tanks, uniforms, and maps. The pistol remained silent, offering no hint of the lives indirectly tied to a makeshift strip of wool. But the truth doesn't need a plaque. It lives in the stories carried by those who survived because someone dared to think differently. It lives in the men who flanked left that morning by the frozen creek and returned home when they otherwise wouldn't have. It lives in the small victories tucked inside immense battles, where the smallest acts ripple outward into consequences no one could predict. Most people have never heard the name William Carver. Now you have. And by knowing it, you help ensure that the legacy of those cold foxholes, those desperate decisions, and those wool-wrapped pistols will not disappear into the snow. If this story moved you, like the video and help keep these forgotten moments alive. Subscribe to the channel to join a community that believes history deserves to be remembered with honesty and depth. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because history belongs to all of us, and every voice helps keep it breathing.